easier.
Yeah, send it to me and I can send it afterward and be like, thanks everyone for coming.
Sweet.
Here's your, yeah, cool. Cool. So I'll give everyone a few minutes. Welcome everyone. I'm gonna give everyone a couple minutes to get settled, get comfortable, and then we will kick off our webinar. Alrighty, I'm going to start doing introductions and talk a little bit about the Alice Paul Center while we wait for everyone else to kind of trickle in, and then we will kick off the presentation. So, hello everyone. My name is Molly Gonzalez, and I am the Advocacy Manager here at the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the latest installment of our Champions of Equality series. This series features conversations with activists, academics, and educators on topics related to gender justice. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you all to join me for our land acknowledgement. So, the land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenape-Hoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historic tribal communities of this region. The Nanticoke, the Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation. The Nanticoke of Willsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend that there may be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Before I introduce our guest today, I just want to remind everyone that we invite you to share your questions during the Q&A portion at the end of our program. We are dedicated to making all of our spaces, virtual and otherwise, safe and inclusive for everyone. Harassment of any kind will not be tolerated in verbal or written comments during APC programs. If anyone chooses to engage in racist, sexist, transphobic, or homophobic speech, or any kind of harassment or bullying behavior, they will be removed from the program without further warning. I really hope we don't have to do that, but I have to say that. So thank you for being a part of our community and for partnering with us to make sure we can remain a space dedicated to equality for all in word and deed. Anyway, cool. My name is Molly. We are here today at the Alice Paul Center. And we are so lucky to be joined by Dina Castillo. They are the Healthy Relationships Coordinator and Kaleidoscope Advocate at the Pride Center at the Center for Family Services. We have a really exciting presentation today. And like I said earlier, please hold all your comments and questions to the end. You can throw them in the chat, and then at the end, we will read them. So without further ado, please clap. Oh gosh, I hate webinars because you can't all clap and see each other, but clap in your home for Dina. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm imagining the loudest, grandest round of applause right now. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for the invite. I can't see faces, so that's gonna be tricky for me because when I start seeing head spin, I know to slow down and explain something a little slower. But that's all right. We're gonna go for it today. So this presentation is called LGBTQ plus 101. So just to talk about what we're gonna get into. Um, we're going to start with some LGBTQ plus identities. Now, I don't have tons of time with you all today. So, and if you know me, if you've seen, I think June might be in here. I get carried away sometimes. I'm good at doing a lot of this. I'm Italian and Guatemalan, so I can talk. I can talk. So we're gonna. Hopefully you're gonna be able to walk out of here with a pretty good understanding of some identities. Maybe you'll be introduced to some that you've never heard before. And if you have heard of all of them, then maybe you'll still feel inspired to learn more because none of these lists are going to be exhaustive by any means. We're going to take a look at some legislative violence. And what I mean by that is we're going to take a look at some of the legislative concerns that a lot of queer people are facing right now, have an understanding of the legislative landscape that we're looking at. And that'll kind of segue us into talking about gender affirming care. Lots of mis and disinformation out there about what that is. So I'm hoping maybe we can clarify some of that and answer any questions you might have. We'll talk about the importance of affirmation and, of course, allyship and community, the importance of feeling connected to community, creating community, experiencing belonging, and how allies can really show up and signal safety and create safety and then signal that to queer folks in the community. All right, we're gonna go for it. We're gonna dive in. I'll try to monitor the chat, and we'll see how we do. All right, so we'll start with some terminology, like I promised. Now I got to start with the acronym. Anytime I do a 101, I start with the acronym. If you are an expert on the acronym, hey, take this as a little pop quiz for yourself. If you were hoping I'd go over it, I like to collect my brownie points pretty early on. See, I like to show you I got your back right from the start. So I'm really not going to go too in depth into this. What I do want to start by saying is when we talk about identities, I want you to think of these less as very strict definitions and more so as guidelines, right? We're talking about something like an identity. It's really nuanced. And what I mean by that is if we have, 10 people who identify as bisexual and we ask them what that means for them, they might have 10 different understandings of what that means for them, right? So just because you know the quote unquote definition of a particular identity, it doesn't necessarily mean we can copy and paste that on every individual. We still want to give people the space to be able to share what their identity actually means to them. But it will give us a general guideline as to what that identity might mean, if that makes sense. All right. So the other thing I'll point out is the distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So sexual orientation is in reference to other folks. It's external, right? The attraction you might experience towards another person or persons. And gender identity has everything to do with who you are, has nothing to do with really anybody outside of yourself, right? So we don't really consider these terms as interchangeable. They're two completely distinct ideas. One does not predict the other, right? So we hold them as separate. All right. So when we talk about L for lesbian, typically women attracted to other women. G for gay, typically men attracted to other men. B for bisexual, typically a person attracted to two or more genders. Then we get to transgender, and here's where we switch from sexual orientation to gender identity, right? Their gender does not match their sex assigned at birth. And we're going to talk a great deal about trans folks and really answer any questions you might have in that department. Lots of disinformation about that community as well that I hope we'll be able to address today. And they are the most vulnerable in the community when we talk about violence, risk of violence, really at every level, institutional, interpersonal, domestic, and intimate partner violence as well. So we'll break that down a bit. And then we have Q for queer. Now, a couple different reasons why someone might use the term queer. It is an umbrella term, simply indicates that somebody's a part of the community. So one of the reasons might be maybe they have looked at other identities and nothing really has completely captured who they are. And so they want to rely on something a little bit broader, in this case, the term queer. It's also really ambiguous, right? If I tell you I identify as queer, you know that I'm a part of the community, but you don't know in exactly what way. And for a lot of people, that ambiguity offers a real sense of safety and comfort. Now, needless to say, it's not always had a positive connotation, right? This was a derogatory term. And while a lot of people have reclaimed this as a form of empowerment, not everybody has, right? Especially like with our Pride Center, when we come across older queer folks that have experienced this term in a really traumatic way, they might not be comfortable with the term queer. So it's important that we don't assume everybody in the community is comfortable with this term. The first piece of advice I'll give to you all today is to simply replicate the language that is offered to you. If somebody identifies as gay, pretty much using that term exclusively to describe who they are in any given appropriate situation. If you know they're a part of the community, but you don't know in what way, and you want to use the term queer, but you're not sure, you could just say they are LGBTQ plus identifying, or they're a part of the LGBTQ plus community. And then the giant plus sign is just to say there are many, many, many more identities. I'm looking at my screen here, and it looks like I'm in a bat cave or something. I don't know why it looks that dark. I hope I'm not freaking anybody out here. Okay, I'm a huge jokester. That's why it's hard. I love doing this stuff in person too, because otherwise it's just me giggling in silence. But that's okay. We embrace it. We embrace it. All right. So like I mentioned, lots of other identities that aren't included in that preliminary acronym. Exhibit A. I told you, I like to have your back. Why wouldn't I send you off with some extra, right? So some other sexual orientations that are becoming more widely known, more widely used, it's important to be aware of, because in our work, professionally and potentially even personally, we might come across these terms, and it might be good to know what they are, at least be familiar with how they sound, right? So the first two on here are pansexual and omnisexual. Now stick with me here, right? Both of these terms, and again, this is all just general guidelines, right? There could be somebody in this room that identifies as pansexual, and as I start talking, they go, Dina, yeah, that's not how I experience that. Cool, right? We're not trying to create a strict definition. These are just generally what we understand these terms to mean. So both of these terms refer to the capacity to experience attraction towards any and all genders. Now, the nuance here is you can think of pansexual as gender blind and omnisexual as gender aware. So what do I mean by that? By gender blind, I mean that the other person's gender identity, the way they express that gender identity, doesn't play the primary role in why person A finds person B attractive. There might be other characteristics that play a more primary, salient role in why they experience that initial attraction to person B. Gender aware is a bit like the opposite, right? Like the other person's gender identity, the way they express that gender identity does play a significant role in why they might find individual B attractive. Scoliosexual is an attraction to non-binary genders. We are going to define non-binary in a second here. So if people are scratching their heads, worry not, worry not. You're in good hands here. We'll get to it, I promise. Um, but essentially, the way we can start to think about this is when we think about the traditional um, way of thinking about gender, we think of it as in a binary system, meaning two main categories, man and woman, right? So non-binary people are essentially people that don't fit within that framework, or at least don't fit comfortably within that framework. So, but I promise we'll get there. So asexual folks are folks who experience sexual attraction in a way that might not be consistent with what is traditional or expected. They might not experience physical attraction at all. And that's not to say that they can't experience romantic attraction, right? So, what I mean by that is there are plenty of asexual individuals who are in very loving, long term committed relationships. And demisexual, we're almost through the terminology. Stick with me here. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. But demisexual is kind of under this umbrella of how to experience uh, attraction or experience an orientation that might differ from what the norm is, the statistical norm. So demisexual, for example, is attraction based on connection. And what I mean by that is they don't really experience physical or sexual attraction until there is first an established, meaningful emotional relationship or connection created, right? All right. I'm hoping all that made sense. We're gonna keep chugging along, especially because I don't have too much time with y'all. And as you can see, they call me like an energizer bunny at work. So I'm a wind-up toy. Once I'm like ready to go, I'm like, all right. So because I have lots to share with you, we're gonna keep pushing. But of course, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. I'd be more than happy to answer that later. Um, I want to share some other gender identities as well. But before we do that, I want to make clear the distinction between gender identity and sex assigned at birth. A lot of times we use these two terms interchangeably, right? When you go to fill out a form at a doctor's office, they ask you for your sex assigned at birth, and oftentimes they'll have gender identities listed. So, one of the things that we want to do, and one of the charges we're taking, is how do we understand and how can we communicate with society that these two things are distinct? And that's through language. So when we talk about sex assigned at birth, we're using terms like male, female, intersex, etc. When we're talking about gender identity, we're using terms like man, woman, transgender, non-binary, so on and so forth. So when we think about the category of sex assigned at birth, these are all the secondary sex characteristics. We're talking about, hormones, reproductive systems, reproductive organs, so on and so forth. All the kind of biological classification. Gender, on the other hand, is the social classification, right? This is rooted in a lot of social cultural norms, gender roles, right? Hobbies, fashion. And we can kind of see the creation of this category of gender and how it's evolved throughout history. The easiest place to look is the fashion industry, right? High heels were originally made for men, right? The higher the heel, the higher the status. That's obviously changed, right? High heels are now seen as a feminine, quote unquote, feminine product. And so, again, what we have done throughout history is kind of connect these two ideas, right? If an infant is born with XY chromosomes, then they're going to wear a suit and tie at a wedding. There's nothing kind of biologically inherently true about that. That's something that we created, a standard that we created as a society, right? And so with gender, we created these two categories, right? Man and woman. We assigned particular roles and expectations under each category. And for most people, right, they're comfortable in that. And there are some people that simply do not fit within that categorization. So that opens up, a lot of different gender diverse identities as well. So to start, the first gender identity we have on here is cisgender. This is essentially just means non-trans, right? So the prefix cis meaning same side of. If you were assigned female at birth, for example, and you identify as a woman, you are under the category of cisgender, right? So most people identify as cisgender. Transgender now is a bit like the opposite. So in that same example, if you were assigned female at birth, but you identify as non-binary, gender fluid, a man, then you are transgender. Your gender identity does not match the one it was assigned at birth, right? Gender fluid is pretty intuitive. There's a fluidity in the way gender is experienced. Gender queer, a bit like that original term queer that we talked about, but this time with regard to gender. So it's really ambiguous, really open-ended, really up for interpretation. Gender non-conforming, this can have to do with gender identity itself, but it can also have to do with gender expression. So everybody in here, it's a small group today, all five of us, we all express our gender every day, right? With the clothes that we wear, the way that we do our hair, maybe we throw on a fragrance, what shoes we throw on, maybe we throw on some jewelry, makeup, perhaps. These are all ways that we express our gender identity. And gender nonconforming folks essentially often express their gender in a way that doesn't conform to the expectations. I always use myself as an example, right? I was assigned female at birth, but even as a little kid, I did not want any makeup. I didn't want to wear dresses or skirts. If my mom like forced me to wear nail polish, I'd literally be walking around like this, like, no, no. I remember thinking as a little kid, like, man, I wish it was boys that were the ones that had to have the long hair and girls that had to have the short hair, right? So I didn't conform to how a little girl was supposed to look, supposed to behave, um, what I was supposed to want to look like, right? So I didn't conform in that sense. All right. So those are just some examples. There are many, many more, but I do want to focus a little bit more on non-binary folks, and that's just because, I mean, especially in our Pride Center, we see more and more and more non-binary folks, and a lot of service providers that I do provide these trainings to um, are seeing that too, are seeing that trend, and want to understand a little bit better what this means. So like I said, that traditional framework of this binary system of these two buckets, these two categories, doesn't really work for everybody. And so, an alternative is to, instead of viewing gender as these two very rigid categories, you can think of it as a spectrum. This is just one alternative, one ideology of how to imagine gender. But if you look at it as a spectrum, you can see it has a lot more room to include a lot more people, right? So on one end, you have boy and man. On another end, you have girl and woman. And then you have this kind of in between, right? And a lot of non-binary people like to be thought of as living somewhere along this spectrum, though I caution you because there are a lot of non-binary people that go, wait a minute, the way you're looking at this spectrum, you're still in some way reinforcing the binary because there are two main ends to the spectrum. And a lot of non binary folks say, I don't want to be thought of as living in between the binary. I want to be thought of as living completely detached from the binary. So, just again, offering you an invitation to think about gender identity in a way that maybe you've not thought of before. Maybe you have, and I'm inviting you to continue thinking about different frameworks that will include more people. Um, it's really, really fascinating stuff because, again, gender is socially constructed. So thinking about and here I'll shamelessly plug myself, right? We're working on a presentation called The History of Gender. So hey, if you want us back, let me know. But it's interesting to think about why this category was created in the first place, how it was created, and why there's so much meaning on it. So if that's intriguing to you, let me know. Okay, pronouns. Here we go, right? So a lot of times when I present to social service agencies, I'll do a lot of police departments, um, clinicians. I present to a lot of clinicians. Pronouns is where they want to live at, right? Like, how do I get better at pronouns? What do pronouns really mean? And essentially, they're a form of gender expression, right? They're a way to signal what your gender identity is, right? So just these are just some examples for you. I like this chart because on the right hand side you can see it lists some the pronunciation of a lot of these. Now, as we look at the bottom here, we have some different gender neutral options. I'm sure we've come across they them pronouns using them in the singular. We also have the inclusion of some neo pronouns. Now, this is where I wish I could see your faces because usually this is where I start to get like the really, the head tilts and they're like, what's that? And I start to lose people. But stick with me here, okay? These are just a gender neutral alternative in terms of pronouns. They have been around for a really, really long time. In fact, the first example we saw of neopronouns was actually the word thon back in the 1800s. They actually combined the words that and one to create thon, right? It's this gender neutral option. And again, it's just a way of signaling a detachment from our traditional understanding of gender, which again is very restrictive and not a lot of wiggle room in terms of expression and identity. Now, again, like I said, I get carried away because I love this stuff. I love learning about it and I love sharing information about it, but we don't have tons of time. So if you have any clarifying questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. I feel like a YouTuber. Feel free to put it in the comment section down below. Like and subscribe, folks. I'm feeling silly today. It's Friday Eve. It's Friday Eve. It's always a good time. All right. And the last thing I have on this slide is a little example sentence. So when I work with a lot of folks, they'll go, I understand they, them pronouns. It's hard for me because it's grammatically incorrect to use it in the singular. And I always push back a little bit and I challenge them to think about this. And I say, don't we use it all the time though, when we don't know the other person's gender identity, right? If you're walking in the park and you see a pair of keys on the floor, you say, oh, someone lost their keys. I'm going to take it to the police station so they can get it back, right? We just use they, them in the singular, and it made perfect grammatical sense. We've been using they, them in the singular since the 1600s. That's the earliest we see it in literature. And so the challenge really, and there is a challenge, the challenge is not necessarily a grammatical adjustment. It's how do we apply this gender neutrality when our brain is looking at an individual and receiving all these signals about who that person might be based on what we've learned, right? We look at an individual, we see long hair, we see dress, and we see heels, and we think girl, 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 girl. How do we interrupt that process to go, let me let that person tell me who they are, as opposed to imposing what I've learned onto that individual? That's where the difficulty is. That's where the challenge is. And it is an adjustment. I am not here to say it is easy to really make that shift, but it is possible with just a little bit of practice. I used to struggle with it, right? And I use they, she pronouns. And it was a little bit of an adjustment. And we do this work every day. And sometimes we misgender folks by accident as well. It happens. Just apologize, move on. And the important bit is make sure you're taking the time to really invest in practicing these pronouns, in really learning more and educating yourself around this in more detail. All right. So I'm going to move to the legislative violence. I'm hoping the terminology stuff wasn't too tedious for you, but we're going to move to talking about some legislative stuff. Because a lot of the legislative violence that we're seeing, and we're intentional about calling it a form of violence, and we'll talk about why, is really targeting the trans community in particular. I just wanted to provide some stats on um, trans folks, right? We've all interacted with a trans person, whether we know it or not. They are part of our society, of our community, and it's important that we just don't marginalize them even further and push them to the side and ignore their rights, right? They're human beings. They contribute to our society and our culture. So, with that being said, this is the not so fun stuff. This is the not so fun stuff. So stick with me. But I want to show you a trend of anti-trans legislation being introduced into Congress over the last few years. So in 2018, we saw 19 anti-trans bills. In 2022, we saw 155. And this was as of October 13th of 2022. So we actually closed out that year with around 174 anti-trans bills. Now, to show you that unfortunately this exponential growth is still very much alive. In 2024, we saw 658 anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced. This is not specific to New Jersey. This is nationally, right? And unfortunately, in 2025, 953 anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced into Congress. And y'all, I update this number a lot. I mean, I would say by the end of 2025, we'll definitely break 1,000, which is really, really unfortunate. And I don't want us to get caught up in this just being a number. I mean, every single sheet of paper that we see here in these stacks is a direct threat to the physical, the emotional, the medical, spiritual well-being of an individual. And the most vulnerable, of course, whenever we talk about any kind of vulnerabilities, are youth, right? So a lot of the anti-trans legislation that we're seeing is directly looking to restrict access to gender affirming care. So let's talk about what that is, right? So this is one of the definitions offered to us by the World Health Organization. A little verbose, so stick with me here. But it's the social, psychological, behavioral, and medical interventions essentially designed to affirm somebody's gender identity when it conflicts with the one they were assigned at birth. So a lot of trans folks will describe their experience as there being a disconnect between their mind and their body. And what gender affirming healthcare does is essentially help reduce that disconnect, or at the very least, de-emphasize that disconnect. So I want to make it really clear that gender affirming care is not just some surface level mechanism to simply alter somebody's body. It goes much deeper than that, right? It's actually there to treat gender dysphoria. So this is defined as the psychological distress that results from that disconnect, right, between your mind and your body. And it's a defined clinical condition. So one time I presented to some clinicians, and they said, if you could spread a message to all clinical staff that work with queer people and trans folks, what message would you give? And it was, when we talk about treatment and when we talk about the psychological distress, what we're treating is the dysphoria. The problem is not transness, right? The problem is that trans folks live in a society that want to repress that gender diversity, that want to repress the variation of gender expression. And so, again, the treatment here is for gender dysphoria, that psychological distress, not the fact that they are trans, right? And I want to make that really clear. There is no problem with transness. And not every trans person experiences gender dysphoria. Not every trans person feels there's a disconnect between their mind and their body, right? And so I want to make that clear, because not every trans person wants to access every level of gender affirming care. So we also can't make that assumption. So I wanted to share some different buckets of what gender affirming care can look like. So we have the social, the legal, the medical, and the surgical. Now, the social is everything we've kind of been talking about, right? We hear a lot about this, and this is where allies and folks in community can really make a difference in affirming people's identity. This is where we have the most power as people part of the public. Pronouns, right? Respecting people's pronouns. A lot of trans folks, and when I say trans, that includes all gender varieties, right? Non-binary folks, gender fluid. But a lot of trans folks will pick a new name that doesn't trigger their gender dysphoria. Some trans folks will even work with a speech therapist to work on the pitch and tone of their voice. Anything to do with outward appearance. So whether that be chest binding to appear more flat chested, whether that be a haircut, clothes that you wear, anything that's going to outwardly affirm their gender identity and going to be perceived by the outside world and by themselves, of course. The legal cluster has anything to do with government issued documents. So that can look like updating a gender marker on a driver's license or passport. That can look like updating a name on various government issued documents, birth certificates, again, think passport, driver's license, updating a photograph on those respective documents as well. And it's important that the legal matches who the person is because we don't want moments of escalation to create a sense of insecurity or unsafety. And when I work with police departments, they'll talk about this, right? Like some police officers will bring up instances where they pull somebody over and maybe they're further along in their transition and their driver's license doesn't really reflect the progress that they've made in their journey. And that gets dicey, right? Because it can lead to really invasive questioning. Obviously, there is a really tumultuous relationship between law enforcement and the queer community. If we talk about the history between those communities, and really the horrors that queer people had to face at the hands of law enforcement. And so we want to be able to avoid any kind of escalation to keep both police officers safe and, of course, to keep queer folks safe in community as well. The medical cluster has things to do with puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. So I'm going to start with puberty blockers because I've been hearing a lot of information, mis and disinformation in particular, around what puberty blockers are and how they started. So I'll start by saying puberty blockers is for youth entering their stages of puberty. They take puberty blockers to essentially push pause on that process. It does not permanently stop puberty, right? So when you come off of puberty blockers, puberty resumes as normal. Now, when you take a look at medical literature and what researchers are saying, the only two things that specialists really have to keep a close eye on if you're on puberty blockers is bone density, and you might be a centimeter taller if you were on puberty blockers than if you weren't. Other than that, everything resumes as normal, right? Everything essentially is it's not permanent. The changes are not permanent. And the other thing I want to mention, puberty blockers have been around well before they were used as a form of gender affirming care. They've been around since around the 1970s, really early 1970s, for youth who were experiencing precocious puberty. So these were youth, they're not LGBTQ identifying, just kids who were going through puberty faster than their peers. And there's no real medical risk associated to this process, but it was creating psychological distress among these youth, right? They're going through puberty a lot faster than their classmates, and it made them uncomfortable, anxious, depressed. And medical professionals created this tool, this mechanism called puberty blockers. Now, fast forward, those medical specialists, those medical professionals are seeing a whole other cohort of youth that are experiencing distress due to the stages of puberty. And they say, hey, wait a minute, why don't we use that same mechanism and apply that here to this group of youth as well? So puberty blockers, again, they were not created for trans folks. It's incredibly helpful for trans youth, and it's impactful, but that's not why they were created. Meaning they've been around for a while, they're studied, the process is sound, and we can trust that process. And the last thing I'll add here is there are no youth who are simply going to their primary care physician asking for hormones and going home with them. They're working with a team of specialists, right? And especially if you're under the age of 18, you require parental consent in most states. But otherwise, you're working with a team of specialists, you're working with clinicians, you're working with an endocrinologist who's monitoring your hormone levels. And so, again, the process is sound. Hormone replacement therapy is a little bit more permanent, and it's used for folks who are in most states is you have to be 18 or older to access that. Now the changes here are a little bit more permanent, like I said. For example, if you take testosterone to masculinize, your vocal cords thicken, which is why your voice drops. That's a little bit harder to reverse without any kind of other medical intervention. But again, you're working with a team of specialists, and it's made sure that it's being done in a safe, age-appropriate way. And then lastly, we have the surgical cluster. This one's pretty intuitive, right? Any kind of surgical intervention to affirm somebody's gender identity, whether that be what we call in the community top surgery, facial reconstruction surgery, so on and so forth. Okay. I hope that made sense to you all. I hope you're not getting too tired of my voice. We're almost there. We're almost there, everybody. Hang in there. So just to share the legislative landscape right now, currently 27 states restrict transition-related care for folks under the age of 18. More states are considering the same. The really disheartening thing is 40%, 40% of trans youth live in one of these states where transition-related care is restricted or banned altogether. And that's unfortunate because there's a section of those youth that never got the opportunity to begin with to start their transition. And there's also a cohort of youth that did have access to this life-saving care that were forced to forfeit that because of the regulations that came into place. 24 states impose penalties on healthcare practitioners that provide folks under the age of 18 with any forms of gender affirming care as well. And I did want to share just one of the many studies that note the positive impact of access to gender affirming care. This particular study was noted by the American Medical Association. It followed 100 trans and non-binary youth for 1 year post-hormonal therapies, primarily puberty blockers. And what they found was those youth experienced 60% lower odds of moderate to severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality compared to the youth that did not have access to that care. So again, this is just one of the many examples of why we call this life-saving care. We have the opportunity to really help people feel affirmed, to feel safe in their bodies, and essentially to reduce odds of severe depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Now, outside of that, when we talk about affirming spaces and the importance of affirming spaces, there was a group of researchers at the University of Texas, and they surveyed folks between the ages of 13 to 24 in which social spaces they could have their affirming name and pronouns affirmed and respected. So they looked at school, home, work, and friends. And for folks that had their name and pronouns respected in each of these categories, they experienced 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, and 65% decrease in actual suicidal attempts. Again, that is all just with the social cluster. That is just with their affirming name and pronouns being affirmed, legitimized, and respected in these social categories. Just imagine what we can do if we can ensure that all of the spaces that youth, young adults, and older adults walk in and live and breathe in actually feel respected in those spaces. Think about the kind of positive impact we're having. I mean, the opportunity we have to really change people's lives for the better and to save lives ultimately. So I always like to share that study as well because it has nothing to do with even the access to the medical care. So imagine combining access to life-saving medical care along with safe and affirming social spaces. I mean, there's a real opportunity there. So I want to end with things that we can do to take allyship seriously, right? And the first thing is to really recognize that our allyship, whether you're in the community or not, has an immense impact. I mean, a lot of folks will kind of just use that term loosely, but if we actually take that term seriously, we can do a lot with it. So the first thing is education. So of course, look, step one, you came here today. That's a great form of allyship. But continuing to look for educational opportunities, offering them to folks, but even doing some education on what are the legislative concerns, right? Looking that up, staying updated with that so that you can kind of stay in the know and queer people don't have to necessarily explain that to you all the time. You're kind of there with them. You're staying in tune, you're staying tapped in, and you're understanding where a lot of these youth are coming from when they experience resistance to interacting with social service programs, resistance when it comes to talking to their guidance counselors, when they're experiencing poor mental health, so on and so forth. Speaking up, especially like if you're in a workplace where you have like the one queer person that's like the spokesperson for queer advocacy, like making sure you're joining them in that effort. You're not always putting the onus on them to do the advocacy, speaking up if you hear them get misgendered, if you hear somebody misgender a queer person that is not in your presence. That's especially when allyship is meaningful, right? And of course, leading with empathy, understanding that everybody's coming from a different way of life, a different understanding, and we want to find ways to bring people into the conversation even when it's really difficult, right? To really find ways to invite people in, to really understand where they're coming from, and to find ways to connect. If we can find ways to connect, that's where we make a real change. And this is where the importance of community lives, right? There are times where, like my job is to go out and to be an advocate, to be a spokesperson. And sometimes I get really exhausted, right? Because I'm constantly kind of battling people's skepticism around this. And while I absolutely love what I do, sometimes it does take an emotional toll. And that's why community is important because sometimes, especially in my personal life, I don't want to have to be that person, right? So to have other people around me that will be an advocate, that will be a spokesperson, so that I don't have to, is how we recharge, is how we keep this train moving. So you can be a part of that impact as well. Policy and culture matter. So making sure not only are we establishing a culture of affirmation, of safety, of uplifting marginalized voices, but we're also making sure that they're codified, right? That we have policy in place that protects folks. Creating gender neutral spaces, utilizing gender neutral language, and uplifting existing policies as well. For example, the New Jersey law against discrimination, right? They are statewide protections, essentially, that talk explicitly about what protections queer students in particular have, right? So, regardless of parental consent, regardless of what district regulations are, if there is a trans student that wants to go by an affirming name that is not their name assigned at birth, that has changed their pronouns, that needs to be respected and reflected on government documents, on school documents, rather. And again, that's regardless of parental consent, regardless of what those district regulations are, because this is a statewide protection. So it's important to know about that if we do come across students that have that struggle. I have come across a couple of schools myself that were not aware of this protection. So learning about what's in place and again, spreading that information. And then we also have the New Jersey Equality Directive for law enforcement. There are protections that queer and trans folks have when it comes to how law enforcement interacts with them. This in particular is one of the Attorney General directives of 2019, and it places a large emphasis on how to interact with trans folks in an affirming way. It outlines the affirming language that police officers are mandated to use, and ways to have affirming interactions when it comes to searches, detainment, housing, transportation, so on and so forth. Now, it's important to uplift this. Like I said, I go to some police departments, and a lot of police officers don't know about this, right? So, what good is ink on a page if we actually don't know about it and can't actually enforce it? So, spreading information about these protections as well is important. And then lastly, things we can do with our language, right? The way that we talk about queer experiences, as opposed to saying things like sexual preference or lifestyle, we say sexual orientation. As opposed to saying somebody is biologically male or female, we say they were assigned male at birth, they were assigned female at birth. Instead of saying sex change or gender reconstruction surgery, we say gender affirming surgery. This one's interesting too. Instead of saying preferred pronouns, we want to drop the word preferred, because that kind of backfired on our community, right? We started by asking everybody, ask us our preferred pronouns. And then people took the word preference as an option whether or not to respect it. So not preferred pronouns. What are your pronouns? What are your affirming pronouns? What is your affirming name? And go from there. This is another really great graphic here, as just some more language tips, as opposed to saying he is a transgender or he is transgendered. You just say he is transgender, for example. Another one on here that's good to point out, when he was a girl or before he became a boy, you can just say when he presented as a female or pre-transition, so on and so forth. Did you get the surgery? Pretty much never appropriate to ask that question. We come across that a lot for some odd, peculiar reason. If you hear somebody ask a queer individual that question, stepping in to say, I don't really think that's any of your business, or I don't think that's really appropriate to discuss here, to kind of save an individual from a very awkward, invasive conversation. Okay. That is all, my friends. Here's our contact information. So if you want to get in touch with our Pride Center, you have my name and phone and email right at the top left corner here. I'd be more than happy to chat. If you have other training needs, I'm funded to be able to offer trainings along LGBTQ plus competence, violence prevention, queer burnout, so on and so forth, for folks that either are based in or serve Burlington or Mercer County, and it's free. So if you know of other agencies, of organizations that would benefit from trainings like this, just let me know, and I would love to schedule something with you. And the other thing I'll say is Kaleidoscope is our peer-led groups for LGBTQ plus teens and young adults. So we meet once a month in person. If you know of queer teens and queer young adults that are looking to meet other people, to go out into the community and just kind of let their shoulders down. It's not a clinical space. It's really just a space for them to get together, play some games, have some fun, connect with each other, just feel connected to community, essentially. We also just started a new group called Rainbow Roots. This is also under Kaleidoscope, but it's for queer parents with school-aged children. So if you know of parents that are looking to connect with other queer parents that are local, let me know, and I would love to send you the form to sign up for those as well. And then lastly, this is the last thing, I promise, our LGBTQ plus resource hotline. The cool thing about this is that it's statewide. So if you have any need for resources, if you're looking for affirming healthcare, housing, training needs, you can call that number and they'll introduce you to various different programs or services across the entire state of New Jersey that might help point you in the right direction. So that's 844 NJ Prism. So spread that number far and wide. Thank you once again for your time and attention. I really, really appreciate the invite and I really appreciate your engagement with this content. And I will be sending Molly a link to a survey. So I know you're all sitting here going, "Wow, it was the best presentation I've ever heard in my life. What do I do with all this feedback?" You pour it into that survey. In all seriousness, it does help with our funders. Love to see what we're doing and hopefully help us expand um, some of that funding and those opportunities. So keep an eye out for that link. I'm hoping you'll take some time to fill that out. All right, I'm done for real now. Thank you so much, Molly. I
Gina, that
really
was
appreciate it.
amazing. That was incredible. I
Thank
was like
you. Thank
expecting to hear more applause, but I forgot that this is not recording. But that was incredible. I'm gonna let some questions pour in, but I have a couple questions as
Sure.
we close it out. Um, two things that well, there's a lot of things I loved about this presentation. Two things that really stuck out to me. One was kind of this idea, this theme that it's okay to be curious and it's okay not to know as long as you kind of lead with love and compassion. I think there's a lot
Yeah.
of among maybe straight people, there's this like fear of not saying the right thing and then being banished from gay people forever, which like
Yeah.
doesn't work that way, as much as we sometimes, no, I'm just kidding. It doesn't work that way. And so I think people are scared in a way that feels weird when you're just a human being trying to exist. And so I appreciate this real, importance on like, it's okay to be curious. It's okay to ask a question. I think we forget that a lot. And
Yeah.
so my question, I got, and oh, and I loved the line, replicate the language offered to you. I wrote that one
Mm.
down. That's such a good line of like, if someone says they're gay, you don't have to go jump through hoops to
Yeah.
use
Yeah.
words you
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know. It's
Yeah.
okay if they're
You don't
gay,
have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, they've offered to you. They just use it. It's
I
on a
already
silver
told
platter
you.
for you.
But something I think about a lot is, we talk a lot about how straight people can be better allies. And I am curious if you have any advice for like people who are already within the community, how can like, because I do think there's a real problem with like gay, lesbian, and bi cis people not showing up for trans folks. And I'm wondering if, what you guys think about that, what you talk about that, and your work of like how do people within the community be better allies to other people within the community? Because sometimes it's vicious, and I don't understand how
Yes.
to unpack that.
It is. And that's just a result of a lot of like the systemic and institutional pressure. It's a lot of the internalized stuff that we have heard, right? Like we've internalized a lot of homophobia and transphobia and biphobia. And unfortunately, that becomes projected onto sometimes people closest to us and sometimes entire communities. And so I think it's really, really important to connect with other people's stories. Read literature. I mean, like right now, I'm reading one of the most like all-time famous, well-known books, Stone Butch Blues, right? And when you dive
You're
into
ready
a
to
book like
cry.
that, I know and it's like, and I'll warn anybody who's like interested in really connecting with other parts of the community that it's a difficult book to get through, but it's
Um,
so important because you learn about these other people's experiences. Not only do you learn how distinct their experience might be, but you learn how similar you might be as well, and how ultimately you're all just fighting this pressure to have to conform. You're all trying to return to the self. And I'll explain that a little bit because a lot of times when we talk about what the mission of queer liberation is this idea that we need to completely transform the ourselves. It's all about reformation, but really what it's about is restoration, right? We're trying to return to the self. The minute we were born, not even since before birth, we had all of these expectations and we had to forfeit a lot of our behavioral traits, a lot of our personality traits, our likes, our dislikes. We had to forfeit that. And how do we actually reconnect with those parts of ourselves? And I think the first thing you have to do is connect fully with yourself to understand this is about a journey home. And once you do that, I guarantee you'll be more open to other people's experiences. I think a lot of the pushback and a lot of the what you said, a lot of it is so vicious, and I witnessed that, and it blows my mind. Is I think that person's still trying to return home. So how do we give people that path back to themselves, and hopefully that'll create more empathy. A lot of this stuff is not because of a lack of education. We have access to the internet. We have access to all kinds of info. It's about building that empathy, strengthening that skill set to connect with others. We're not taught to do that. So how do we learn to do that and offer that to ourselves and ultimately that'll help us offer it to other people as well.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Yeah, that's like so well said. I also think a lot of times people like cis people see femininity as like they're in shackles by it. And so when they see
Yeah.
people like exercise it in cool new ways, they get really offended and don't know how to
Yeah.
deal with it. And like even like cis women who like experiment with gender presentation, it can be really like scary because it takes so much work to be a woman that when someone puts in a different amount of work, it like rocks someone's world, especially if your whole world, like, because so much of being a cis person is also about maintaining a gender. If that means like shaving your legs or wearing earrings, like
Yes.
all of it is about gender maintenance. And so when we're confronted with people who do it in a different way, sometimes do it a lot better, it's like really hard to wrap your
Yeah,
head
and
around
there's
what,
probably
wait,
some resentment there, right? It's like
yeah,
how are you free from those shackles? And I'm still
yeah,
expected to play the game in order to earn safety, access to resources,
yeah,
societal acceptance. How do you get all that? But you're not having to play the same game that I am. So that's interesting.
yeah, the game, yeah. But it's like, yeah. And it sucks because you want to say just don't play, like throw the pieces in the air and like,
Right.
rip your nails off or whatever. But like you get
Right.
treated different. It's like unfair to
You
say that
do.
because you do get treated different based on how you look. And like, so
Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, young people are so exciting and cool right now because there are more people like this Gen Z has more people who are out than any other generation at that age. And I think that's like the most
Yes.
beautiful thing to be
At
young and
Kaleidoscope, all the teens, I mean, they use terms like sometimes I'll be in a meeting and they'll be using terms. I'm like, okay, let me write that down. I got to look
I
that
don't
up
know that
later.
one.
They know so many. I mean, that was not my experience when I was in like middle
Yeah.
school, high school, like it's amazing to see how the world has really opened up for them and the access to this
Yeah.
language and the community they have. I mean, it's really beautiful to witness, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Like there's a Reddit called r slash late bloomer lesbians where it's women of like all different ages. Most of them are like 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I saw a post by a woman in her late 80s and I was like crying and I couldn't handle it. But it's about like, a lot of them are like, wow, I can't believe there are so many young people when, for so long people had to live in such shackles and like not being able to be themselves. And so I think it's also important for young people not to take that for granted. I mean, looking at the
Mm,
chart that you made with all of the different anti-LGBT bills, like made me shiver because it's
yeah.
weird that there's both this like legislative violence and then pockets of more social acceptance. I don't know. I don't know how to like grapple with that. It's weird whiplash.
Yeah, it's hard to process and it leads to, that queer burnout that I was talking about. I mean, you think
Yeah,
about, especially youth in particular, how casual they have to be exposed to and forced to engage in debates about whether or not their identity is legitimate, whether or not it's um, really valuable, right? And they're just like turning on the
yeah.
TV and it's like a debate about whether they should exist or not. I mean, it's horrible.
It's
It's horrible,
crazy.
and it takes a
Yeah.
toll, an emotional toll, but also a physical toll. You know what I mean, all around. It's hurtful, and
Yeah.
it leaves people vulnerable.
Yeah, I hope that there's like more positive stories, I guess, of queer people doing their thing, living their life that can be good role models. I mean, I think we've seen that in the past couple of years. Like movies where the lesbians don't die at the end, you know what I mean? Where
Yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah,
they
yeah,
don't
yeah, yeah.
like have to like they don't get caroled at the end and they get torn apart by
Yeah.
Kate Blanchett's husband or whatever. And so I think having like role models is also such an important thing that hopefully continues to grow. I mean, I think the most magical part about being queer is that your future isn't already written for you the way it is for straight people. Like
Yes,
there's this
yes.
timeline where you get married and you have kids and you go to college and like it's already written for you. And I that to me sounds oppressive in its own way. And I like am an
Yeah.
ally to straight people because I think that sounds really hard if your future has already been written for you. And LGBT people do have this privilege of like the future has not been written and you are allowed
It's
to
true.
create it yourself. Like that's so cool. And
It's true.
I think
Right
is
now,
my
I'm
yeah.
I'm currently planning a wedding, which, by the way, is very expensive and very stressful.
Can't
but
imagine.
but one of the cool things is that so we don't really feel this connection to have it look a particular way. I mean,
Uh,
and a lot of cis people, I mean, like my fiance's sister, right? Cisgendered, heterosexual, and very much restricted to a particular way of how it's supposed to go and how it's supposed to look. We get to play around with that. We don't really feel a pressure to adhere to what that standard is. And wedding
yeah.
culture is insane, insane.
Yeah,
So
like
it's
you
like
guys don't
nice
have
to
to
not
like come
have to
on
like be a
Eileen. You
part of
can do
that.
like, you can have a Sophie song. It doesn't have to be Come on Eileen,
Right, right, right,
or
right.
whatever. Sweet Caroline is not going on,
Right,
We're not doing that, y'all.
right.
But
Right,
that's
right.
so true and so cool. And like, yeah, the that to me is like the quintessential part of being queer is like you do because it hasn't been pre-written for you, you get to be the auteur of your life.
Yeah, I love that. I love
Yeah.
that.
So it's not all doom and gloom. It rocks.
It's not all doom. It's about finding the balance,
And
right?
yeah, it's really cool that you do this like to police and to workplaces, like to people where it becomes life or death, practitioners of healthcare, practitioners of like everyday services and care that like add up. Like that to me feels like really good gender affirming care to get misgendered at a
Yeah,
restaurant. If that happens enough times, it's like I can't even imagine the like psychological toll of that. And
right.
to
Yeah,
provide
yeah.
trainings is really cool. So, yeah, I can't wait to send this around so that other places can get you in their workplace. You
Yeah,
can
I
tell them
like
what's
it.
up. Um, yeah. Is there any more questions? Does anyone have any questions? And I see a message about Rainbow Roots. So,
Okay,
you send me information about that, and I'll put that in our follow-up email to
perfect.
everybody who was here and signed up and stuff.
Amazing.
That's a great
Amazing.
resource. Um,
Great.
yeah. Well, okay. Thanks everybody for being here. We have a really exciting event. We have two exciting stuff happening at EPC. We're going to do another Champions with the Center for Family Services on August 7th about resisting violence within the LGBTQ community. You can please follow us on Instagram at Alice Paul Center and you'll learn like when that is. It will also be on Zoom. And then on August 23rd, we have our biggest event of the year, which is our Women's Equality Day Festival. I'm really excited. It'll be from 12 to 4 p.m. There's going to be vendors of like women-owned, there'll be a women-owned craft fair with different vendors and artists. There'll be a food truck. There's going to be beer gardens. There's going to be a gay puppet show called Some Bunny to Love, where two gay bunnies fall in love. And I will be in tears in the front, cheering it on the whole time. You're not going to want to miss this. And there's going to be speakers and panels and a bounce house. It's for everybody. It's for kids. It's for the ladies, but it's also not for the ladies. So maybe you'll meet some ladies there. I don't know. It depends on how cool of a you are. No, just kidding. Okay, anyway, it's getting late. Thank you all so much. We hope to see you all soon. And oh wait, now we're getting Q&As. Oh, it's all. Oh, it's nice things. Thank you. Love you, June. We love you, June. You're the best.
June. This is the June fan club.
Yeah, this really is. Yeah, we're all like June. Yeah, we're June's number one fan. Really, here. June's the best. If you're not familiar with Dr. June, you have to check out her work. That'll be, she just wrote an incredible article that I will put in the follow-up email because it gave me chills. So anyway, we're gonna stop now. Bye, everybody. Love to all. Every month is Pride Month. Yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye,
Mwah.
everyone.